I never thought I'd be the girl hiding in a hotel bathroom at 2 a.m. frantically Googling how to disappear completely. But that's exactly where I found myself 3 months after what should have been a simple coffee date. Looking back now, I can see all the red flags I ignored, but when you're lonely and hopeful, it's amazing how your brain can rationalize away the warning signs that could save your life. It all started on a rainy Thursday evening in October. I'd been single for about 6 months after ending things with my college boyfriend, and my friends kept nagging me to get back out there. I'd resisted downloading dating apps for the longest time. Something about the whole concept felt artificial and desperate. But after spending another weekend binge-watching Netflix alone while my roommate was out with her new boyfriend, I finally caved. I spent way too long crafting the perfect profile, agonizing over which photos made me look approachable but not desperate, intelligent but not intimidating. I must have rewritten my bio 20 times before settling on something that mentioned my love of hiking, indie coffee shops, and terrible reality TV shows. Within minutes of going live, the matches started rolling in, and I felt that little dopamine hit that I now know these apps are designed to trigger. Most of the conversations were pretty generic, "Hey beautiful" messages that got deleted immediately, or guys who clearly hadn't read my profile at all. But then I matched with someone named Marcus, and something about his first message made me stop scrolling. Instead of a generic pickup line, he'd noticed a detail in one of my photos, a book I was reading in the background, and asked thoughtful questions about it. We had the same taste in authors, the same dry sense of humor, and our conversation flowed effortlessly from books to movies to our shared hatred of small talk. Over the next 2 weeks we texted constantly. Marcus seemed almost too good to be true. He was a software engineer who'd moved to town for work, originally from Portland, loved hiking as much as I did, and had this way of remembering tiny details from our conversations that made me feel genuinely heard. He'd reference something I'd mentioned days earlier, ask follow-up questions about my stressful day at work, even send me funny memes that perfectly matched my sense of humor. When he finally asked me out, I was genuinely excited for the first time in months. We planned to meet at a trendy coffee shop downtown on Saturday afternoon. Public, casual, perfect for a first date. I spent embarrassing amounts of time getting ready, changing outfits 3 times before settling on a sundress that struck the right balance between cute and effortless. Marcus looked exactly like his photos when I spotted him at a corner table. Tall, dark-haired, with kind brown eyes and a warm smile that made me feel instantly at ease. The first hour flew by as we talked about everything and nothing. He was charming, attentive, asking thoughtful questions about my job as a graphic designer and sharing funny stories about his own work. I found myself thinking that maybe online dating wasn't so bad after all. But about halfway through the date, I started noticing little things that didn't quite add up. When I mentioned my college, Marcus claimed he'd visited the campus once, then proceeded to describe details about the library that were completely wrong. When he talked about his job, his descriptions were oddly vague for someone who supposedly worked in tech. And there was something about the way he asked questions. They felt almost scripted, like he was gathering information rather than genuinely getting to know me. I tried to push these concerns aside. Maybe I was being paranoid, reading too much into innocent inconsistencies. Marcus was sweet, funny, and seemed genuinely interested in me. When he suggested extending the date with a walk through the nearby park, I agreed, despite the nagging feeling in my gut that something wasn't quite right. The park was beautiful that afternoon, with golden sunlight filtering through the autumn leaves. Marcus held my hand as we walked, and for a moment I forgot my earlier doubts. But then he started asking more personal questions. Where exactly I lived, what my daily routine was like, whether I lived alone. When I gave vague answers, he'd circle back to the topic later, always with a charming smile that made it hard to refuse. As we sat on a bench overlooking the pond, Marcus's phone buzzed constantly. He'd glance at it, frown, and quickly put it away, but not before I caught glimpses of what looked like multiple conversation threads. When I jokingly asked if he was popular, his face darkened for just a split second before the charming smile returned. "Just work stuff," he said, but something in his tone made my blood run cold. That's when I noticed the folder on his phone screen, labeled with what looked like women's names. My heart started racing as pieces began falling into place. The scripted questions, the vague job details, the way he seemed almost too perfect, like he was playing a character designed specifically to appeal to me. I made an excuse about needing to get home, and Marcus walked me to my car like a perfect gentleman. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just escaped something dangerous. That night, I did what any modern woman would do. I stalked his social media profiles. What I found made my skin crawl. Marcus's Instagram was too perfect, too curated. Every photo looked professional and there were no tagged friends, no casual snapshots, nothing that suggested a real life lived by real people. His Facebook was even stranger. Created just 3 months earlier, with the bare minimum of information and no mutual friends despite claiming to have lived in several cities. But it was when I reverse searched his photos that everything became terrifyingly clear. The pictures he'd used were stolen from a male model's portfolio. Someone named David who lived in California and had no idea his face was being used to catfish women across the country. My hands were shaking as I blocked Marcus on every platform I could think of. But the damage was already done. He had my phone number, knew where I worked, had carefully extracted details about my life and routines. I barely slept that night, jumping at every sound, wondering who Marcus really was and what he wanted from me. The next morning, I found a bouquet of my favorite flowers on my doorstep. Sunflowers, which I'd mentioned loving during our conversation. There was no note, but I knew they were from him. The fact that he knew where I lived, that he'd been there while I was sleeping just upstairs, made me feel violated and terrified. I called in sick to work and spent the day researching. What I discovered was a nightmare I never could have imagined. The dating app community forums were full of warnings about sophisticated catfish operations, men who used stolen photos and carefully crafted personas to manipulate women into emotional relationships, extracting personal information and sometimes even money. But Marcus seemed different. He hadn't asked for money, hadn't tried to build a long-distance emotional connection. He'd wanted to meet in person, had gone through elaborate preparations to have a physical date. The more I researched, the more I realized I might have stumbled into something much more dangerous than a simple catfish scam. I started getting texts from unknown numbers, different phones, but all with the same tone, the same knowledge of our conversation. I had such a great time yesterday. Can't wait to see you again. You looked beautiful in that blue dress. Each message felt like a violation, proof that whoever was behind this was still watching, still planning something. By the third day I was a nervous wreck. I'd installed security cameras, changed my locks, and was seriously considering taking a leave of absence from work. That's when my best friend Sarah intervened. She took one look at my state, unwashed hair, dark circles under my eyes, the same pajamas I'd been wearing for 2 days, and insisted I tell her everything. Sarah listened with growing horror as I explained the whole situation. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment before saying the words that probably saved my life. "We need to call the police. Now." The detective who took my statement was surprisingly understanding. Apparently, elaborate catfish operations targeting women through dating apps were becoming increasingly common, and they'd been tracking several similar cases. They took copies of all my evidence, the fake profiles, the messages, the photos, and promised to investigate. But they also gave me advice that chilled me to the bone. Change your routines immediately. This person has been studying you, learning your patterns. Don't go anywhere alone, especially not places you mentioned to him. And consider staying somewhere else for a while. That night, I packed a bag and went to stay with Sarah. As we drove to her apartment, I kept checking the rearview mirror, paranoid that we were being followed. Every car behind us looked suspicious. Every face in the crowd could have been Marcus, or whoever he really was. It's been 6 months now since that terrifying week, and I'm still dealing with the aftermath. The police never found him. The phone numbers led to dead ends. The photos were untraceable beyond the original theft, and the dating profile had been deleted within hours of my report. Whoever was behind it was clearly experienced, probably targeting multiple women simultaneously. I still jump when unknown numbers call my phone. I've moved apartments twice, changed jobs once, and I haven't been on a single date since. My therapist says I'm making progress, but the paranoia lingers. Sometimes I catch myself scanning crowds, wondering if he's out there, if he's moved on to other victims, or if he's still somehow watching me. The hardest part is the isolation. I've lost faith in online dating entirely, but in today's world, how else do you meet people? I feel like he stole something fundamental from me. The ability to trust, to be vulnerable, to believe that someone's interest in me could be genuine rather than part of some elaborate manipulation. But I'm sharing my story because I want other women to know the signs, to trust their instincts when something feels off. If a match seems too perfect, if they ask too many personal questions too quickly, if their social media presence feels artificial, listen to that voice in your head. It might save your life. I still don't know who Marcus really was or what his ultimate plan might have been. But I know one thing for certain. I'm grateful every day that I trusted my gut and got away before finding out. I thought I knew what a messy breakup looked like until I lived through one that literally rewrote my entire existence. 6 months ago, if someone had told me that my ex-boyfriend would steal my identity, manipulate my friends, and nearly convince everyone I knew that I was having a complete mental breakdown, I would have laughed in their face. Now I'm sitting in a new apartment in a new city with a new phone number, wondering if I'll ever feel safe enough to trust anyone again. It all started when I finally worked up the courage to end things with Tyler. We'd been together for almost 2 years, and on paper, everything looked perfect. He was successful, charming, and everyone loved him. My friends always told me how lucky I was, how Tyler was such a catch. But behind closed doors, he was controlling, manipulative, and had this terrifying ability to make me question my own reality. The final straw came when I discovered he'd been going through my phone, reading my messages, and even responding to some of my friends pretending to be me. When I confronted him about it, he didn't deny it. Instead, he calmly explained that he was just looking out for me, making sure I wasn't making any bad decisions in my friendships. That's when I realized I was dating someone who genuinely believed he had the right to control every aspect of my life. Breaking up with Tyler was like trying to escape quicksand. Every time I thought I'd made it clear that we were over, he'd find a way to pull me back in. He'd show up at my apartment with my favorite takeout, claiming he just wanted to talk. He'd send long, heartfelt emails about how he was working on himself and deserved another chance. When I blocked his number, he'd call from different phones, always with some urgent reason why we needed to speak immediately. 4 weeks after the official breakup, Tyler's behavior followed a predictable pattern of escalation. First came the guilt trips, messages about how devastated he was, how he couldn't eat or sleep without me. Then came the bargaining phase where he'd promised to change to give me space to be whoever I needed him to be. When that didn't work, he shifted to anger, sending late-night texts calling me selfish and ungrateful for throwing away our perfect relationship. I thought I was handling it well. I'd blocked him on everything, avoided our usual hangout spots, and even started seeing a therapist to work through the emotional manipulation I'd endured during our relationship. My friends were supportive, checking in on me regularly and reassuring me that I'd made the right decision. For about a month, life actually started to feel normal again. That's when the weird stuff began happening. It started small, friends mentioning conversations they'd had with me that I didn't remember. My coworker Sarah casually brought up the vacation I was apparently planning to take, a trip I'd never mentioned because I wasn't planning one. My sister called to ask why I'd canceled our weekend plans via email when I'd never sent any such message. Each incident was minor enough to brush off as miscommunication or forgetfulness, but together they formed a pattern that made my skin crawl. Then I started getting calls from businesses I'd never contacted. A real estate agent wanted to confirm our appointment to look at apartments across town. A wedding planner was following up on my inquiry about their packages. A travel agent had questions about the European vacation I was supposedly planning. Each time I'd explain there had been a mistake, that I'd never contacted them, but they'd insist they had my information, my email address, sometimes even recordings of phone calls. The breaking point came when I got a call from my bank's fraud department. They were concerned about unusual activity on my account. Someone had been making small purchases online, testing the waters before what they assumed would be a larger theft attempt. But when I looked at the transactions, they weren't random purchases. They were things I'd mentioned wanting to buy, books I'd added to my Amazon wishlist, makeup brands I'd talked about trying. Someone wasn't just stealing my money. They were studying my preferences, my habits, my desires. That's when I realized Tyler wasn't just having trouble letting go. He was actively infiltrating my life in ways I couldn't have imagined. Somehow he'd gained access to my email accounts, my social media, maybe even my phone. He was responding to messages as me, making plans as me, living a parallel version of my life where he still had control. I spent that entire weekend going through every account I had, changing passwords, enabling two-factor authentication, and documenting every suspicious incident I could remember. The deeper I dug, the more evidence I found. My Instagram had been posting stories I didn't create, subtle ones, just photos of places I'd been with captions that sounded like me but felt slightly off. My Facebook had been sending friend requests to people I barely knew. Most disturbing of all, my dating app profile had been active, messaging guys and then deleting the conversations before I ever saw them. When I confronted my friends about the conversations they'd mentioned having with me, several admitted they'd thought I seemed different lately, shorter responses, weird timing, conversations that didn't quite flow naturally. But they'd assumed I was just going through a rough patch after the breakup. Tyler had been impersonating me so skillfully that even people who knew me well hadn't realized something was wrong. The psychological impact was devastating. I started questioning my own memories, wondering if I really had sent messages I couldn't remember, if the stress of the breakup had caused some kind of dissociative episode. Tyler had always been good at making me doubt myself during our relationship, and even after it ended, he'd found a way to continue that gaslighting on a massive scale. I knew I needed help, but I also knew how crazy it would sound. My ex-boyfriend is pretending to be me online. Felt like something out of a psychological thriller, not a real problem that happened to normal people. I started with my closest friend, Emma, showing her the evidence I'd compiled. Her reaction, a mixture of horror and rage, validated what I'd been feeling. This wasn't normal post-breakup behavior. This was criminal. Together we went to the police. The detective who took my statement had dealt with similar cases before, though he admitted Tyler's approach was more sophisticated than most. Identity theft for the purpose of stalking was a relatively new phenomenon, made possible by how much of our lives we conduct online. They opened an investigation and advised me to document everything, change all my security information, and consider getting a restraining order. But Tyler was smart. By the time the police contacted him, all the fake accounts had been deleted, the suspicious activity had stopped, and he had plausible deniability for everything. He claimed he'd been trying to protect me from making mistakes, that he'd only been checking on me because he was worried about my mental health after the breakup. He even suggested that I might be experiencing a psychological break, creating elaborate fantasies to avoid taking responsibility for my own actions. The gaslighting continued even through the legal system. Tyler hired a good lawyer who painted me as an unstable ex-girlfriend who couldn't accept that the relationship was over. They suggested that I might be suffering from some kind of delusional episode, possibly brought on by the stress of the breakup and my underlying mental health issues. The fact that I'd been seeing a therapist, which I'd thought would help my case, was twisted into evidence that I was having psychological problems. For weeks, I felt like I was living in an alternate reality where up was down and black was white. People who had known Tyler started treating me differently, like they weren't sure whether to believe me or feel sorry for my apparent mental decline. Some friends distanced themselves entirely, not wanting to get involved in what they saw as messy post-breakup drama. Others tried to be supportive but clearly had doubts about my version of events. The worst part was that Tyler had succeeded in making me question myself. Late at night, I'd lie awake wondering if I really was losing my mind, if the stress and manipulation of our relationship had finally broken something inside me. Maybe I had sent those messages and forgotten. Maybe I was creating an elaborate conspiracy theory to avoid facing the reality that I missed him and wanted him back. It was my therapist who finally helped me see clearly. She pointed out that what I was describing wasn't the behavior of someone having a psychological break. It was the behavior of someone being systematically terrorized by an abuser who had found new ways to continue the abuse even after the relationship ended. She helped me understand that Tyler's greatest weapon had always been his ability to make me doubt my own perceptions, and that he was continuing to use that weapon even from a distance. With professional support and the unwavering belief of a few close friends, I started to rebuild my sense of reality. I kept detailed records of every suspicious incident, every strange conversation, every piece of evidence that Tyler was still manipulating my digital presence. Gradually, a pattern emerged that was too consistent to be the product of mental illness or coincidence. The legal process was slow and frustrating. Getting a restraining order required proving that Tyler was harassing me, but digital stalking and identity theft were difficult to prosecute, especially when the perpetrator was as careful and sophisticated as Tyler. He'd covered his tracks well, and his charm and respectability made it hard for others to believe he was capable of such elaborate manipulation. Eventually, I realized that waiting for the legal system to protect me was like waiting for someone else to save me from drowning. I needed to take control of my own life, even if that meant making dramatic changes. I quit my job, broke my lease, and moved to a different city 3 hours away. I changed my name on all my social media accounts, got a new phone number, and essentially started over from scratch. It's been 4 months since I escaped Tyler's web of manipulation, and I'm still dealing with the aftermath. I'm hypervigilant about my online security, obsessively checking my accounts for signs of unauthorized access. I'm cautious about making new friends, always wondering if they might somehow be connected to Tyler or if he might find a way to use them against me. Dating feels impossible. How do you explain to someone that your ex-boyfriend once stole your identity and convinced half your social circle that you were having a mental breakdown? But I'm healing. I have a new job that I love, a small group of trusted friends who know my story and believe me, and a therapist who specializes in helping survivors of psychological abuse. I've learned to trust my instincts again, to believe my own perceptions even when others question them. Sometimes I wonder what Tyler is doing now, whether he's moved on to another victim or if he's still somewhere out there, waiting for an opportunity to continue his manipulation. I've heard through mutual friends that he's dating someone new, and part of me wants to warn her about what she's getting into. But I also know that she probably wouldn't believe me. Tyler is too charming, too convincing, too skilled at making his victims feel like they're the problem. The hardest lesson I've learned is that abuse doesn't always end when the relationship does. Sometimes it evolves, finding new forms and new ways to maintain control. But I also learned that I'm stronger than I ever imagined, and that the truth has a way of emerging even when it's buried under layers of manipulation and lies. I'm sharing my story because I want other women to know that if something feels wrong, it probably is. Trust your instincts, document everything, and don't let anyone, not even the people who are supposed to protect you, convince you that your reality isn't real. And most importantly, know that you can survive this, even when it feels like your entire world has been turned upside down. I should have known something was seriously wrong when my new neighbor showed up at my door with homemade cookies and an encyclopedic knowledge of my breakup with Daniel. But when you're trying to rebuild your life after escaping a toxic relationship, you want to believe that people are genuinely kind, that the universe might actually be sending you some good karma for once. I was so desperate for normal human connection that I ignored every red flag, every instinct screaming at me that something wasn't right. The breakup with Daniel had been brutal, 2 years of emotional manipulation, gaslighting, and control that left me questioning my own sanity. When I finally found the strength to leave, I knew I needed a complete fresh start. I moved across town to a small apartment complex, changed my phone number, blocked Daniel on every social media platform I could think of, and even switched to a new grocery store and gym. I was determined to create a life where he couldn't find me, couldn't reach me, couldn't continue the psychological warfare that had nearly broken me completely. For the first month, everything seemed perfect. My new apartment was cozy and bright, a complete opposite to the dark, suffocating space I'd shared with Daniel. I was sleeping better than I had in years, actually eating regular meals again, and slowly starting to remember who I was before I'd lost myself in that nightmare relationship. I even started making tentative plans to maybe, eventually, try dating again, something that had seemed impossible just weeks earlier. That's when Margaret appeared in my life like some kind of fairy godmother. She was probably in her early 60s, with silver hair always perfectly styled and the kind of warm maternal energy I'd been craving since my own mother lived 3 states away. She lived in the apartment next to mine and seemed to have an unlimited supply of baked goods, gardening wisdom, and genuine interest in my well-being. Margaret's timing was always perfect. She'd knock on my door just when I was feeling lonely, always with some small excuse, returning a package that had been delivered to her by mistake, offering to water my plants while I was at work, or just checking to see if I needed anything from the grocery store. Our conversations always felt natural and comforting, like talking to a favorite aunt who genuinely cared about my happiness. What struck me most about Margaret was how easy she was to talk to. After months of Daniel's constant criticism and judgment, having someone who listened without trying to fix me or change me felt like a miracle. She'd ask thoughtful questions about my day, remember small details from previous conversations, and offer gentle advice that always seemed perfectly tailored to whatever I was going through. About 3 weeks into our friendship, Margaret mentioned that she'd gone through a difficult divorce herself several years earlier. She talked about how hard it had been to start over, how long it took to trust her own judgment again, and how important it was to be patient with the healing process. Her words resonated so deeply with my own experience that I found myself opening up about Daniel in ways I hadn't been able to with anyone else. Margaret was the perfect listener. She never pushed for details I wasn't ready to share, but when I did open up, her responses were always exactly what I needed to hear. She validated my experiences without making me feel like a victim, encouraged my strength without minimizing my pain, and somehow always knew exactly when to offer a hug and when to give me space. It was Margaret who first suggested I might benefit from talking to other women who'd been through similar experiences. She mentioned a support group that met at a community center downtown, women who'd survived abusive relationships and were working on rebuilding their lives. The idea terrified me at first, but Margaret's gentle encouragement made it seem possible, even necessary for my healing. The support group was everything Margaret had promised. 8 women of various ages, all at different stages of recovery, meeting twice a week in a circle of folding chairs in a fluorescent-lit room that somehow felt safer than anywhere I'd been in years. There was Linda, who'd escaped her abusive husband after 25 years of marriage. Jessica, whose ex-boyfriend had stalked her for months after she left him. Sarah, who was still dealing with custody battles and legal harassment from her ex-husband. Each woman's story was different, but the patterns were eerily similar. The gradual erosion of self-worth. The isolation from friends and family. The way abusers could make their victims feel crazy for questioning obvious lies. The difficulty of explaining to others why it had been so hard to leave. For the first time since leaving Daniel, I felt understood, seen, validated in ways that made me realize how much I'd needed this community. Margaret had been right. The support group was exactly what I needed. But what made it even more special was having her there as my anchor in the outside world. She'd always ask about the meetings when I got home, celebrate small victories with me, and offer comfort when particularly difficult topics came up in group. Having her consistent presence in my life made everything else feel more manageable. It was during our 4th week of meetings that I started noticing strange coincidences. Linda mentioned struggling with her ex-husband's financial manipulation, and the very next day Margaret brought up an article she'd seen about protecting assets during divorce proceedings. Jessica talked about her ex showing up at her workplace, and Margaret happened to have a friend who worked in corporate security who might have advice about workplace safety protocols. At first, these seemed like lucky coincidences or Margaret's naturally helpful nature. But as the weeks continued, the pattern became more pronounced. Every issue that came up in group sessions would somehow find its way into my conversations with Margaret within 24 hours. She always had relevant advice, helpful resources, or personal anecdotes that perfectly matched whatever we'd discussed in our closed, confidential support group meetings. The seed of doubt was planted, but I tried to rationalize it away. Maybe Margaret was just naturally intuitive about these things. Maybe my own experiences were so common that her general advice happened to align with my specific situation. Maybe I was being paranoid, seeing patterns where none existed. After all, Daniel had spent 2 years convincing me I was crazy, and maybe some of that damage was still affecting my perception. But then Sarah mentioned something in group that she'd never told anyone before. A specific incident involving her ex-husband and a particular restaurant where he'd humiliated her on their anniversary. It was an incredibly personal, detailed story that had taken her weeks to work up the courage to share with us. The next evening, Margaret knocked on my door with dinner from that exact restaurant, mentioning casually that she'd heard I might be feeling sad about anniversaries and thought I might need some comfort food. My blood ran cold. There was no way this could be a coincidence. Sarah had never told this story to anyone outside our group, and she'd been specific about the name of the restaurant, the date, even what she'd been wearing. The only way Margaret could have known these details was if she'd been listening to our private group sessions somehow. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying every interaction with Margaret, every perfectly timed piece of advice, every uncannily relevant suggestion. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that Margaret's appearance in my life hadn't been random at all. She'd moved into the apartment next to mine just 2 weeks after I'd signed my lease. Her first conversation with me had included casual references to my work schedule, my exercise routine, details about my life that she couldn't have known unless she'd been watching me. The next morning, I called in sick to work and spent the day doing something I probably should have done weeks earlier, researching Margaret. I started with basic online searches, then moved to social media, property records, anything I could find. What I discovered made my stomach drop. Margaret Thompson didn't exist. Not as the person she'd presented herself to be, anyway. The apartment she claimed to have lived in for 5 years had been vacant until exactly 2 weeks after I'd moved in. The property records showed it had been rented by a company I'd never heard of, paid for 6 months in advance. Her social media profiles had been created around the same time, filled with generic photos and posts that could have been copied from anyone's account. But the most chilling discovery was a connection I found buried in the business registration records. The company that had rented Margaret's apartment was owned by a consulting firm that specialized in personal reputation management and relationship counseling services. And according to their website, their founder and CEO was someone I recognized, Daniel's older brother, Marcus, who worked in corporate consulting and had always made me uncomfortable with his cold, calculating way of analyzing people like business problems. Everything clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Daniel hadn't accepted our breakup and moved on like I'd hoped. Instead, he'd enlisted his brother's professional expertise to stage an elaborate operation designed to infiltrate my new life, gather intelligence about my healing process, and find ways to manipulate my recovery for reasons I couldn't even begin to understand. Margaret wasn't just some friendly neighbor who'd stumbled into my life at the perfect time. She was a hired professional, probably an actress or consultant trained in building trust and extracting information. Every conversation we'd had, every piece of advice she'd given me, every moment of comfort and connection had been carefully calculated to serve Daniel's agenda. The support group, my sacred space, my healing sanctuary, had been compromised from the beginning. Margaret had found a way to monitor my progress, my vulnerabilities, my growing strength, and report it all back to the man I'd worked so hard to escape. Even worse, she'd been using the other women's pain and trauma as tools to manipulate me, turning their authentic healing journey into weapons in Daniel's psychological warfare. I felt violated in ways I couldn't even articulate. Daniel hadn't just refused to let me go, he'd infiltrated the very process I was using to heal from his abuse. He turned my recovery into another form of control, another way to maintain power over my life even from a distance. The betrayal was so profound it made our original relationship seem simple by comparison. But this time, I wasn't the same broken, isolated woman Daniel had controlled for 2 years. I'd learned things about myself in those weeks with the support group, not just from their fake advisor Margaret, but from the real connections I'd formed with the other women. I'd discovered reserves of strength and clarity I hadn't known I possessed. First, I documented everything. Screenshots of Margaret's fake social media profiles, records of the business transactions I'd uncovered, detailed notes about every conversation we'd had that had seemed too perfectly timed. Then I called Jessica from the support group, not to tell her about Margaret yet, but to ask if she knew a lawyer who specialized in stalking and harassment cases. The legal consultation was eye-opening. According to the attorney, what Daniel and his brother had orchestrated was a sophisticated form of stalking that violated multiple laws: identity fraud, invasion of privacy, conspiracy to harass. The fact that they'd hired professionals and created fake businesses to facilitate the stalking actually made it worse from a legal perspective, not better. But gathering evidence and building a legal case would take time, and I needed to protect myself immediately. That evening, I knocked on Margaret's door with a plate of cookies, a bitter irony that felt appropriate. When she opened the door with her usual warm smile, I looked her straight in the eye and said, "I know who you really are and I know who sent you. Tell Daniel that if he doesn't leave me alone permanently, he'll be hearing from my lawyer." The transformation was instantaneous. Margaret's maternal warmth evaporated, replaced by the cold professionalism of someone who'd just been caught in an elaborate lie. She didn't deny it or try to maintain the facade. Instead, she simply nodded and said, "I'll pass along the message." By the next morning, Margaret was gone. The apartment was empty, cleaned out so thoroughly it looked like no one had ever lived there. But I wasn't naive enough to think this was over. Daniel had invested too much time and money in this operation to give up easily, and now I'd revealed that I knew about it, which might make him more dangerous rather than less. I moved again within the week, this time taking security precautions I'd never thought I'd need. New apartment in a different part of town, new phone number, even a new email address and social media accounts. I told the real support group what had happened. Their horror and rage on my behalf reminded me what genuine human connection actually felt like. It's been 8 months since I discovered Daniel's elaborate surveillance operation, and as far as I know, he's finally left me alone. But the experience changed something fundamental about how I move through the world. I'm more cautious about new relationships, more aware of the sophisticated ways people can manipulate and deceive. I've learned to trust my instincts even when my rational mind wants to give people the benefit of the doubt. The hardest part wasn't the deception itself. It was realizing how desperately I'd wanted to believe in Margaret's kindness, how much I'd needed that maternal figure in my life. Daniel had identified that vulnerability and weaponized it with surgical precision. But he'd also underestimated my ability to survive his manipulation once I recognized it for what it was. I'm stronger now than I was when this all started, though it's a hard-won strength that came at a terrible price. I know now that healing isn't just about recovering from past trauma. It's about staying vigilant against new forms of abuse, even when they come disguised as exactly what you need most. If someone's interest in your life seems too perfectly timed, too ideally suited to your needs, trust that little voice in your head that whispers, "This is too good to be true." Sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who study their prey carefully enough to become exactly what their victims are desperately hoping to find. I never believed those stories about dating apps being dangerous until I became the star of my own nightmare. Everyone always said to meet in public places, tell a friend where you're going, trust your instincts. All the standard safety advice that seems so obvious until you're living through a situation where none of those precautions could have prepared you for what was really happening. Looking back now, I can see that I was being hunted from the moment I created my profile, but at the time, it just felt like I was finally having some luck with online dating. My name is Jessica, and 6 months ago I was a completely different person. I was confident, social, maybe a little naive about the darker corners of human nature. I'd been single for about 8 months after ending a pretty serious relationship, and my friends kept pushing me to get back out there. "You're too young to be sitting at home every weekend," they'd say. "Just download one of those apps and see what happens." I'd resisted for months because something about the whole concept felt artificial and potentially dangerous, but eventually loneliness won out over caution. I chose what seemed like the most reputable app, spent way too long crafting a profile that I hoped conveyed intelligence without pretension, humor without desperation. I used recent photos that I thought were flattering but honest, mentioned my love of hiking and cooking, and included just enough personal information to seem genuine without giving away my entire life story. The first few weeks were pretty typical for online dating, a mixture of generic messages, obvious scammers, and a few promising conversations that fizzled out after a couple of exchanges. I went on 2 coffee dates that were perfectly pleasant but didn't lead anywhere, which actually boosted my confidence. This whole online dating thing seemed manageable, maybe even fun. That's when I matched with someone named Alex. His profile was impressive but not intimidating. He was a photographer who traveled for work, had interesting hobbies like rock climbing and cooking, and his photos showed someone who was handsome without being catalog perfect. His opening message referenced something specific from my profile, asked a thoughtful question about my work as a veterinary technician, and included just enough humor to make me smile. Our conversation flowed incredibly naturally from the start. Alex seemed genuinely curious about my life, my thoughts, my experiences. He asked follow-up questions that showed he was actually listening, remembered details from previous conversations, and shared stories about his own life that felt authentic and vulnerable. After 2 weeks of messaging back and forth, I was genuinely excited when he asked if I wanted to meet for dinner. We decided on a popular restaurant downtown, public, well-lit, perfect for a first date. I arrived a few minutes early and was pleasantly surprised when Alex walked in looking exactly like his photos. He was even more charming in person, with an easy smile and the kind of confidence that comes from someone who's genuinely comfortable in their own skin. The conversation over dinner was just as natural as our texting had been, and I found myself thinking that maybe online dating wasn't so bad after all. Alex was the perfect gentleman throughout dinner. He asked thoughtful questions about my family, my career goals, my travels. He shared funny stories from his photography work and seemed genuinely interested when I talked about my passion for animal rescue. When the check came, he insisted on paying but wasn't weird about it when I offered to split it. As we walked to our cars, he asked if I'd like to do it again sometime, and I didn't hesitate to say yes. Our second date was even better. Alex had remembered that I mentioned loving art museums, so he suggested we spend Saturday afternoon at the Contemporary Art Museum across town. He picked me up from my apartment, which felt like a natural progression from our first date, and I appreciated that he'd offered rather than assuming. During our museum visit, I was impressed by his knowledge of photography and art history, and the way he could make me laugh even in the quiet, serious atmosphere of the galleries. After the museum, Alex suggested we grab coffee and walk through the nearby botanical gardens. It was a beautiful day, and something about the combination of art, nature, and his easy companionship made me feel more relaxed and happy than I had in months. As we sat on a bench surrounded by blooming flowers, Alex took my hand and said he felt like he'd been waiting his whole life to meet someone like me. It should have been a red flag, too much too soon. But in that perfect moment, it felt like exactly what I wanted to hear. That's when things started to shift in ways so subtle I didn't notice them at first. Alex began texting more frequently, always sweet messages but more possessive in tone. He'd ask what I was doing, who I was with, what my plans were for the evening. When I mentioned grabbing drinks with coworkers after work, he'd text throughout the night asking how things were going, if I was having fun when I thought I'd be heading home. I rationalized his behavior as enthusiasm rather than possessiveness. Alex clearly really liked me, and after months of dating guys who seemed barely interested, his attention felt flattering rather than suffocating. When he started suggesting we spend most of our free time together, I told myself it was because we had such a strong connection, not because he was trying to isolate me from my friends. The first truly concerning incident happened about 6 weeks into our relationship. I was supposed to meet my friend Emma for our weekly yoga class, something I'd been doing for months before I met Alex. That morning, Emma called to tell me she'd gotten a text from my number saying I was sick and couldn't make it. The problem was I'd never sent that text. When I checked my phone, there was no record of any message to Emma. When I mentioned this to Alex, he seemed genuinely concerned and suggested that maybe my phone had some kind of glitch, or perhaps I'd sent the message while half asleep and forgotten about it. His explanation seemed reasonable and I wanted to believe it, so I convinced myself that I must have somehow sent the text without remembering. But deep down something felt wrong. Over the next few weeks, more strange things started happening. Friends would mention plans I'd supposedly canceled or conversations I didn't remember having with them. My sister called to ask why I'd been so short with her in our last phone conversation, but I remembered that call being perfectly normal. Coworkers started commenting that I seemed different lately, more distracted, less social, oddly unavailable for the after-work activities I used to enjoy. The turning point came when I decided to surprise Alex at his apartment one evening. We'd been dating for almost 2 months, but he'd always come to my place or met me somewhere else. He'd mentioned that his apartment was small and kind of messy since he traveled so much for work, but I figured it was time to see where he lived. I knocked on his door around 7 o'clock, holding takeout from his favorite restaurant and feeling excited about this spontaneous gesture. When Alex opened the door, his face went through a series of expressions I'd never seen before: surprise, panic, and something that looked almost like fear before he managed to force a smile. "Jessica, hi, what are you doing here?" he said, blocking the doorway with his body in a way that made it clear I wasn't being invited in. "I brought dinner," I said, holding up the takeout bags. "I thought we could eat together and maybe watch a movie." Alex glanced back into his apartment, then stepped outside and closed the door behind him. "That's so sweet of you, but tonight isn't great. I have work stuff spread all over the place and I'm expecting some important calls. Maybe we could go to your place instead." Something about his body language, the way he wouldn't let me see inside his apartment, made every alarm bell in my head start ringing. I'd been ignoring my instincts for weeks, but in that moment, I couldn't pretend anymore that everything was normal. "Alex, what's going on?" I asked. "Why can't I come inside?" He ran his hand through his hair, a gesture I'd learned meant he was stressed or uncomfortable. "Look, it's not that you can't come in, it's just that the timing is really bad tonight. I promise we can do this another time when I'm more prepared." But I was already moving past him toward the door. "I'll just peek inside and say hi, then we can go to my place if you prefer." Alex reached out to stop me, but I was already turning the handle and pushing the door open. What I saw inside his apartment made my blood run cold and my legs feel like they were about to give out. The entire living room was covered with photos of me. Not just the professional-looking photos from our dates that I might have expected, but hundreds of pictures I'd never seen before. Photos of me leaving my apartment, walking to my car, at the grocery store, at work, even sleeping in my own bed. The images were arranged on every surface, taped to the walls, creating a shrine that documented my every movement for what looked like weeks or maybe months. But that wasn't the worst part. On a desk in the corner sat 3 laptops, all displaying different screens that I recognized with growing horror. One showed my email inbox, another had my social media feeds open, and the third displayed what looked like a tracking app with a map showing the exact location of my phone. Next to the computers was a stack of notebooks filled with handwritten notes about my daily routine, my friends' names and schedules, even transcripts of phone conversations I'd had in the privacy of my own apartment. "Oh my God," I whispered, backing away from the doorway. What is this? How long have you been watching me? Alex's entire demeanor changed in an instant. The charming, caring boyfriend I'd fallen for vanished, replaced by someone cold and calculating who looked at me like I was a problem to be solved rather than a person he cared about. "Jessica, I can explain," he said, but his tone was flat, businesslike. "I know this looks bad, but I did it because I love you. I wanted to understand you completely, to be the perfect boyfriend for you. Everything I learned about you just made me love you more." I was backing toward the hallway, my heart pounding so hard I could barely think straight. "You've been stalking me. You've been reading my emails, tracking my phone, taking pictures of me without my knowledge. This isn't love, Alex, this is insane." He stepped toward me, and I saw something in his eyes that made me realize I was in immediate physical danger. "Don't call me insane, Jessica. Everything I did was for us, for our relationship. I made myself into exactly what you needed, learned everything about what makes you happy. We're perfect together because I worked to make it perfect." That's when I ran. I sprinted toward the stairwell, hearing Alex's footsteps behind me but not daring to look back. I made it to my car and locked the doors just as he reached the parking lot. As I fumbled with my keys, trying to start the engine while my hands shook uncontrollably, Alex stood outside my car window looking more angry than I'd ever seen anyone look in my entire life. I drove straight to the police station where I spent the next 4 hours giving a statement that sounded so bizarre I could barely believe it myself as I said it out loud. The officer who took my report was surprisingly understanding. Apparently, sophisticated stalking operations involving dating apps were becoming increasingly common. They immediately issued an emergency restraining order and sent officers to Alex's apartment, but by the time they arrived he was gone. What they found in his apartment was worse than what I'd seen in those few horrifying moments. Alex had been surveilling me for almost 4 months, starting from the day I created my dating profile. He'd somehow gained access to my phone, my email, my social media accounts, and had been using that information to craft the perfect persona to attract me. Every conversation we'd had, every date he'd planned, every moment of connection I'd felt had been carefully calculated based on stolen information about my preferences, my history, my psychology. The police investigation revealed that Alex had done this to at least 6 other women over the past 2 years. He'd study his targets through their online presence, infiltrate their digital lives, and then create elaborate fake relationships designed to give him complete control over their lives. Some of the women had never realized what was happening. Others had discovered the truth and, like me, had run before things escalated to whatever Alex's ultimate goal might have been. It's been 4 months since that night and I'm still dealing with the aftermath. I've had to change my phone number, email address, and all my social media accounts. I moved to a new apartment and started seeing a therapist who specializes in helping victims of stalking and digital harassment. I haven't been on a single date since, and I'm not sure when I'll feel ready to trust anyone again. The hardest part is knowing that my instincts had been trying to warn me all along, but I'd ignored them because I wanted so badly to believe in the connection I felt with Alex. Every strange incident, every canceled plan, every friend who mentioned I seemed different. Those were all signs that my life was being manipulated by someone who saw me as a project rather than a person. But I'm sharing my story because I want other women to trust their instincts when something feels off, even if they can't pinpoint exactly what's wrong. If friends are mentioning conversations you don't remember, if plans you didn't make are being cancelled in your name, if someone seems to know too much about your preferences and habits, pay attention to that feeling in your gut that tells you something isn't right. The technology that makes modern dating possible also makes us vulnerable in ways previous generations never had to consider. Our phones, our email accounts, our social media profiles, they're all windows into our souls for anyone determined enough to break in. And sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who study us so carefully that they can become exactly what we're looking for, at least until we get close enough to see behind the mask they're wearing. I survived because I trusted my instincts when it mattered most, even though I'd ignored them for weeks. But I know how easily this story could have ended differently, and that knowledge will probably stay with me for the rest of my life. The first sign that something was horribly wrong came when my mother called me crying, asking why I hadn't returned any of her calls and begging me to let her know I was okay. I stared at my phone in confusion, scrolling through my call log to show her the 3 voicemails I'd left for her just that week. But according to her phone, she'd never received them. According to her phone, she hadn't heard from me in over a month, and the last message she'd gotten was a barely coherent text about going away somewhere and needing space. I'd never sent that text. I'd been calling her regularly, just like always, leaving cheerful updates about my new apartment, my job, my life after finally escaping the nightmare relationship with Kevin that had consumed 2 years of my life. But somehow, none of those calls or messages had reached her. Instead, someone had been sending increasingly worrying messages that painted a picture of a daughter spiraling into depression and isolation. That phone call with my mother was just the beginning of discovering that my entire existence had been systematically erased while I thought I was building a new life. Over the next few hours, as I desperately called friends and family members, the scope of Kevin's manipulation became terrifyingly clear. Everyone I cared about believed I was missing, possibly dead, and they'd been grieving me for weeks while I lived my normal life completely unaware of my own supposed demise. Breaking up with Kevin had been like escaping from prison. He was one of those people who seemed charming and protective at first, but gradually revealed himself to be controlling, manipulative, and utterly convinced that he owned me. He monitored my friendships, criticized my family, and had opinions about everything from my clothes to my career goals. By the end of our relationship, I felt like a shell of myself, constantly walking on eggshells and second-guessing my every thought and feeling. The final straw came when I discovered Kevin had been reading my text messages and emails without permission, then confronting me about conversations I'd had with friends and co-workers. When I told him this was a violation of my privacy and a deal-breaker for our relationship, he calmly explained that couples shouldn't have secrets from each other, and that my desire for privacy was evidence that I was hiding something inappropriate. That's when I realized I was dating someone who fundamentally didn't see me as a separate human being with rights and autonomy. I was an extension of Kevin in his mind, and my attempts to maintain boundaries were threats to his sense of control that needed to be eliminated. I knew I had to leave, but I also knew it wouldn't be easy. I spent weeks secretly planning my escape. I found a new apartment across town, arranged for time off work, and slowly moved my essential belongings when Kevin wasn't around. I opened a new bank account, changed my phone plan, and prepared for the inevitable explosion when Kevin realized I was serious about ending things. The breakup conversation was every bit as awful as I'd expected. Kevin went through all the classic stages: denial, bargaining, anger, and finally threats. He told me I'd never find anyone who loved me as much as he did, that I was making the biggest mistake of my life, that I'd come crawling back within a month begging for forgiveness. When I remained firm in my decision, his mood shifted to something colder and more frightening. "You think you can just disappear from my life like I never mattered," he said, his voice eerily calm. "But you can't erase what we had, Melissa. You can't just pretend like the last 2 years didn't happen. I'll always be part of you, whether you want me to be or not." At the time, I thought this was just typical breakup drama. The kind of possessive, ego-bruised nonsense that most people say when they're hurt and angry. I blocked his number, avoided places we used to go together, and focused on rebuilding my sense of self in my new apartment. For about 6 weeks, my plan seemed to be working perfectly. I was happier than I'd been in years. I reconnected with friends Kevin had gradually convinced me to avoid, threw myself into work projects that excited me, and even started thinking about maybe dating again someday. I called my family regularly, went out with coworkers, and generally lived the normal, independent life I'd been dreaming of during those suffocating months with Kevin. But while I was living my life, Kevin was systematically destroying my digital existence and replacing it with a carefully crafted narrative of decline and disappearance. He'd somehow maintained access to my accounts, either through passwords he'd memorized or spyware he'd installed without my knowledge, and was using that access to intercept communications and send fake messages that painted an increasingly dire picture of my mental state. The fake messages started subtly. Kevin would intercept calls from my mother and send texts apologizing for missing her call, claiming I was busy or stressed or going through a rough patch. When she'd call back, those calls would be blocked or diverted, and she'd receive follow-up messages saying I was feeling overwhelmed and needed some space to figure things out. As weeks passed, the messages became more concerning. Kevin crafted texts that suggested I was struggling with depression, having trouble at work, questioning all my relationships. He sent emails to my friends claiming I was taking a break from social activities and wouldn't be available for our usual plans. Each message was written in a style that sounded like me but painted a picture of someone who was gradually withdrawing from life. The genius of Kevin's approach was that it exploited everyone's natural tendency to give people space when they say they need it. My mother wanted to respect my supposed request for independence. My friends didn't want to be pushy when I seemed to be going through a difficult time. My co-workers accepted my apparent desire to focus on work rather than socializing. Everyone who cared about me was inadvertently enabling Kevin's plan by being considerate of my fake emotional needs. Meanwhile, I was living in complete ignorance of this alternate version of my life. My actual calls to my mother were being blocked, so when she didn't call back, I assumed she was busy. When friends didn't respond to my invitations, I figured they were going through their own stuff. I noticed that people seemed a little distant lately, but I attributed it to the natural adjustment period after a major breakup. Kevin escalated the fake crisis gradually, like a screenwriter building toward a climax. The messages became more desperate, mentioning insomnia, anxiety, thoughts of just disappearing and starting over somewhere else. He sent emails to my family suggesting I was considering a major life change, maybe moving across the country or taking a break from everything familiar. Then came the messages that suggested I was in real danger. Kevin sent texts to my closest friends claiming I was having thoughts of self-harm, that I felt hopeless and didn't know how to ask for help. He crafted emails to my family that read like suicide notes, not direct threats, but concerning enough that everyone who received them was terrified about my mental state and safety. The final phase of Kevin's plan was both brilliant and deeply sick. He sent a series of messages over the course of 3 days that told a story of someone preparing to disappear permanently. First came texts about needing to get away from everything, about feeling like a burden to everyone who cared about me. Then came messages about going somewhere peaceful to think through some major decisions. Finally, there was silence. For 2 weeks, everyone who loved me received no communication at all. No responses to their increasingly frantic calls and texts, no social media activity, no signs of life whatsoever. Kevin had effectively murdered my digital existence, leaving behind just enough concerning messages to suggest that something terrible had happened to me. My family was beside themselves with worry. My mother called the police to file a missing person report. My friends organized search parties and posted my photo on social media asking if anyone had seen me. My co-workers told my boss they were concerned about my well-being, which led to HR getting involved and ultimately to my job being put in jeopardy due to my apparent instability and mysterious absence. During those 2 weeks when everyone thought I was missing or dead, I was living my normal life completely unaware of the crisis Kevin had manufactured. I went to work, ran errands, watched Netflix, and generally enjoyed the peaceful existence I'd built for myself. I noticed that people seemed to be avoiding me, but I told myself I was just being paranoid or overly sensitive. The truth came out only because of a random coincidence that Kevin couldn't have anticipated. I ran into my college roommate Lisa at the grocery store, someone I hadn't seen in months and who wasn't on Kevin's list of people to manipulate. When she saw me, she literally dropped her groceries and started crying, pulling me into a hug and saying over and over how worried everyone had been. "Melissa, where have you been?" she sobbed. "Your mom called me last week asking if I'd heard from you. She said you'd been sending really scary messages and then just disappeared. Everyone's been looking for you." I stared at her in complete confusion. "What are you talking about? I've been right here the whole time. I call my mom twice a week, I see friends regularly, I haven't disappeared anywhere." But as Lisa described the messages my family and friends had been receiving, the horrible truth started to dawn on me. Someone had been impersonating me online, crafting a narrative of depression and disappearance while I lived my actual life in blissful ignorance. And there was only one person who had both the motivation and the technical knowledge to pull off something this sophisticated and cruel. The next few hours were a nightmare of phone calls and explanations as I tried to convince everyone I cared about that I was alive, well, and had never sent any of the disturbing messages they'd received. Some people were so relieved they just cried. Others were confused and suspicious. If I was fine, why had I been sending such concerning messages? Did I not remember sending them? Was I having some kind of psychological break? Kevin's manipulation was so thorough that even after I exposed it, some people remained convinced that something was wrong with me. The fake messages had been written in a style that sounded like me, and they'd been sent from accounts that appeared to be mine. How could I prove that I hadn't sent messages I had no memory of sending? Unraveling Kevin's digital manipulation required hours of forensic work with my phone company, email providers, and social media platforms. What we discovered was a sophisticated scheme involving cloned accounts, intercepted communications, and spyware that had been installed on my devices without my knowledge. Kevin had essentially created a parallel version of my digital life that he could control while blocking my actual attempts to communicate with the outside world. The psychological impact of discovering that I'd been digitally murdered while I was still alive was devastating in ways I couldn't have imagined. Everyone I loved had spent weeks grieving me, preparing for the worst, dealing with the trauma of thinking they'd lost me forever. The relief they felt when they learned I was alive was mixed with anger, confusion, and in some cases, lingering suspicion that I'd somehow been involved in my own fake disappearance. Kevin had succeeded in poisoning my relationships even after I'd escaped from him. Some friends never fully trusted my explanations and gradually distanced themselves, unable to shake the feeling that something about the whole situation didn't add up. Family members remained worried about my mental health, convinced that someone capable of inspiring such elaborate deception must be more unstable than they'd realized. The legal system was frustratingly inadequate for dealing with Kevin's sophisticated form of abuse. While what he'd done was clearly stalking and harassment, proving it required technical expertise that most law enforcement agencies didn't possess. By the time we'd gathered enough evidence to press charges, Kevin had disappeared, apparently having anticipated that his scheme would eventually be discovered. It's been almost a year since I learned about my own fake death, and I'm still dealing with the aftermath. I've had to rebuild relationships with people who spent weeks thinking they'd lost me forever. I've struggled with paranoia about my digital security, constantly checking and rechecking my accounts for signs of unauthorized access. Most difficult of all, I've had to accept that Kevin succeeded in damaging my life and relationships in ways that may never fully heal. But I've also learned important lessons about the vulnerabilities we all carry in our interconnected digital world. Our phones, emails, and social media accounts are extensions of ourselves, and anyone with enough technical knowledge and malicious intent can use them to rewrite our stories without our knowledge. The most dangerous abusers aren't just those who use physical violence. They're the ones smart enough to weaponize the technologies we depend on to maintain our connections with the people we love. I'm sharing my story because I want people to understand that abuse doesn't always end when the relationship does. Sometimes it evolves, finding new and more sophisticated ways to maintain control and cause harm. If people in your life start receiving concerning messages that don't sound like you, if friends and family mention conversations you don't remember having, if you feel like people are treating you differently for reasons you can't understand, pay attention to those signs. Trust your instincts, document everything, and don't let anyone convince you that your reality isn't real. And most importantly, understand that healing from this kind of abuse isn't just about moving on from a bad relationship. It's about reclaiming your identity from someone who tried to erase you while you were still alive. The person I was before Kevin tried to murder me digitally was trusting, optimistic, maybe a little naive about the depths of human cruelty. The person I am now is warier, more guarded, but also stronger in ways I never expected. I survived Kevin's attempt to erase me, and I'm determined to make sure no one ever has that kind of power over my life again.